Nostalgia is a hell of a drug. And we watch movies with the glasses on, trying to recapture that euphoric moment of the first time we saw a film like this when we were kids.
Today we're talking the 40th anniversary of iconic horror comedy film Return of the Living Dead with Matt Blazi from the George Romero Foundation Network. So, Matt, tell me a little bit about the George Romero Foundation Network, your role there, and kind of how you got involved in that.
Yeah, the foundation started obviously after George had passed, post 2017. Around that time, my friend Eric Kent and I had decided that we wanted to talk more Romero now in a post Romero world, and we started doing some deep cut, at least to us, deep cut type interviews with folks that worked with George, but you don't always get a chance to hear from. You don't see them on the documentaries, you don't hear them in the commentaries. And we started talking to various folks across his entire filmography, and included talking to Suze Romero. We did a watch along over Zoom with like Terry Alexander, Laurie Cardell, Mark Tierno, and a couple other cast folks from Day of the Dead. And they all had a good time. We had a good time. And then we started kind of co-collaborating, where they would send us someone to talk to, like Dan Krause, who finishes George's book, The Living Dead. Mm-hmm. And then we decided to do another show with them when Host had been coming out. That was the big, Zoom movie over COVID.
Right.
And the week that dropped on Shudder is we had the entire cast, the director, writer, producer. We did a big show online. And afterwards, Suze was like, "Hey, I want to do this, more often." So we said, "All right, let's do it. Anything for George, I'd love to get back to." So during COVID, we signed up and we started doing retrospectives, cast and crew reunions. We were doing some live commentaries, anything to celebrate independent film that we grew up loving, and then also focusing on new and upcoming horror, whether it's the Screams in a Box competition every year, where kids get like 48 hours to make their own short film. We air all those films and do a competition. We do the like the Romero Lifetime Achievement Award thing mm-hmm. every year. And then, we spotlight, actors, directors, or upcoming movies with some of our partners. We did a screening for some of our longtime donors of George's unfinished lost film expostulations. We did some other things. So we've been doing that with the GARF for a little over 5 years now. Suze is wonderful. Jeff, who does a lot of the day-to-day stuff, is wonderful. Really, one, keeping George's memory alive and celebrating him, because for those of you that don't know George was always like, it's fine, it's a movie, it's what are you talking about, and he would always have people gushing over him, but they were movies to him. He didn't see himself as anything but a movie director. We're out here celebrating the man left and right, which I think rightfully so. And part of that is we want to keep that alive, because there's just so much that George gave the horror community, not just in terms of movies and characters and ideas, but he brought a lot of us together as friends, and we become family and co-collaborators and all of that stuff. And the GARF really helps kind of solidify that, and wants to preserve George's legacy, promote his work, those that worked with him, and then also helping spearhead future independent filmmakers. I think we're in a boom of new and independent film. With the advent of streaming, we're able to watch a lot more than what we've ever been able to. There's a lot more stuff that's accessible to us, where growing up in the 80s and 90s, going to the video store, they may or may not carry a bunch of movies, and you might never see them.
Right.
So it's a good thing to be doing that, and being a part of keeping George's name ever present with the horror community, because he's always going to be felt, but we want to make sure that not only do the people that grew up and loved him and knew him and worked with him, but introducing new generations to the groundwork that he laid so that they can look back and say, well, George did this with this amount of money and this is what he overcame. And it shows that you don't need $100 million budget to make a good movie. You can make a good movie on almost any budget. You just have to have the right people and the drive and desire and vision to go after it. And I think that's really what the main focus of the Garf is.
All right. Kind of along, in some ways, Return of the Living Dead, it does fit into loosely at least, into the George A. Romero filmography, right? He obviously he didn't write it and direct it, but it does share certain DNA, right?
Yeah. The movie is, I believe, co-written or written by John Russo, who was, one of George's early collaborators. They kind of took the Living Dead world and kind of branched off, and George did his own thing, and John did his, and John came up with what became this punk rock mid 80s classic where the zombies are different. I think the whole zombies eat brains thing goes directly back to Return of the Living Dead, and I think that really was one of the first things zombies are known for in pop culture is brains.
Right.
And I think that helped spearhead that into more of the mainstream. When you look back at stuff like Thriller and all the late night spoofs and parodies, they were Return of the Living Dead spoofs. But I think it helped solidify a lot of what George had been doing. I mean, at that point, Return of the Living Dead, he had his original trilogy out by that time, so Day had been out. But I think it really helped kind of propel George's films into more of the mainstream as people went and looked for more zombie films. I think Return of the Living Dead was more of I don't want to say success and take away from anybody, but I think it was one of those where it was more marketable and palatable for the everyday film goer, where George's films are seeped in multiple layers of themes and different dynamics and relationships, and they are very serious in tone with obviously some comedic and comic book elements. But Return of the Living Dead does share its DNA with George and Night and Dawn by the time it had come out.
It is interesting when you talk about the Romero legacy is, the phrase "the living dead" and the dead. There's a million, right? You probably know this better than I do. A million movies inspired by Romero zombie themes, and I guess when I was growing up, Return of the Living Dead was one of those movies that would be in the $3 DVD bin. I'd be like, oh, this is some knockoff Dawn of the Dead thing, but it's not, and it's in a lot of ways I feel like it does hit a lot of the same themes as George's films, just in a completely different, very 1980s tone. Would you say that's accurate, or am I just riffing into?
No. I think you're exactly right. I think George's films are super products of their time, between the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so is Return of the Living Dead. Like I said, the whole punk rock subculture is very prevalent. Where you have this group of, at that time, social outcasts, misfits, whatever you want to call them, and you got a couple of the kind of straight edge suburban kids,
right?
So you have an eclectic group that you wouldn't think would be friends, just based on the look of
But it
them.
is super weird that they're hanging out together in the cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, you got Freddie, who's got this job, at this warehouse, and you got people like Trash and all these people, and it's like, okay, how did they become friends? They must have been friends their entire lives, because there's no way these guys crossed paths in high school, especially in the 80s. Because
right.
You gotta remember all the teen comedy drama movies of the 80s. You were in different sects, you were in different classes, and social circles and that hierarchy. So it is really weird how that worked. It doesn't take away from the film. I think it's one of the things that really has always stood out to me is how did this group get together? But they don't. They subvert a lot of the teenage 80s tropes with a lot of the teenage dramas not being in it. It doesn't really, it doesn't have sex. It's got nudity, but it's not, it's a product of its time, but it doesn't try to mirror or mimic any one particular genre in one way or another.
Yeah.
It's on its own, and I think that's why it works, because it's not trying to duplicate anything George did. It's taking zombies and putting it to this like badass heavy metal soundtrack of the 80s, this punk rock stuff. And there's, I don't want to say there's stereotypes in the movie. You've got the punks, you've got the quote unquote suburban good kids, but they don't play up those angles where your stereotypical teenage comedies at the time. You have your jock, your nerd, your pretty girl, and the shy kid and whatever. They really don't play with those, and I do enjoy that.
Yeah, they're just like
Because
archetypes for like a reference point. You're like, okay, that's what this person is like, and like they don't dive into that where it's like, because movies like that also can age very poorly when they lean super hard into like, this is the kid who listens to Black Flag, or like this is Poindexter over here, like.
Yeah, I mean, when you go back and you look at, like, especially like the John Hughes movies of the 80s, those things don't technically age well in this day and age. You're really going to find the humor in them if you grew up watching them. But if I were to show my 14 or 17-year-old kids almost any 80s teenage movie, it's almost going to be like a foreign language.
Yeah,
To
absolutely.
them. And a lot of stuff was rooted in deeply rooted social stigma, stereotypes, and whatnot. We don't live in that world anymore, and I think that's why George's films and Return of the Living Dead kind of go around that timeline that those raunchy comedies are in, and it just keeps going forward, because it doesn't call back to the fact that it's the 80s, other than the fact that they look like they're in the 1980s. So it's one of those things that I think helps make those movies timeless, which is what George did as
Yeah.
well.
And actually, to that point, the essential conceit of this movie, I feel like, is aged very well with the idea of, oh no, the military lost a whole bunch of trioxin, this chemical, and it just happens to be in some guy's basement, and he doesn't want to give that up. It's played for laughs, but in some ways, to me, it seems like it is a very apt, and maybe it reflects the era we live in now, very apt social commentary there.
Yeah, I mean, imagine driving down the road and you see just this barrel from you can obviously tell it's from the military. We ain't taking that home.
Right.
We're 40 years later, we're smart enough to not trust the
Right.
military that loses anything on the side of the
Right.
road. But you're right. There was something about him kind of taking that and keeping it there because he didn't know what to do with it. And I think it was one of those, well, I'm not going to call the number because I'm going to get in trouble, so I'm just going to keep it away. And I think the other good thing is, the horror films of the 80s, for a vast majority of them, you're kind of rooting for the killers,
Right.
because the kids are those stereotypes. They put themselves in that situation where these guys they're innocent.
Right.
Everyone in this movie, no one in this movie went out to do anything and put themselves in that. They didn't go to the camp where the murderer was, and they didn't go into the haunted house, or they didn't recite the spell in the book and make the demons rise or whatever. And I think the only other movie series in horror around this time, and it hadn't really popped off yet, Nightmare on Elm Street. It's the one horror franchise where I really feel that the kids are all victims. They
Yeah.
don't, and you really can't do anything in those movies because Freddy's going to come get you in your sleep. But they're not even pushing the envelope by like, oh, well, we're at the camp next door, or we're just, we're in the house behind the haunted house and we're going to go explore it and, not leave it be. So I think that's why it can be somewhat relatable, because these kids are just waiting to go have a good time, and
Yeah.
shit goes sideways.
Yeah, exactly. And even, with Frank in the opening scene, like, what coworker hasn't wanted to impress somebody by showing them some cool stuff in the basement, right?
I mean, if I
Right, that's just a
worked,
natural human impulse.
I mean, if I worked in a medical supply place, I want to see what you got in the basement because that's going to be stuff you don't see every day.
Right.
And I want to see the cadaver hanging in the locker. I want to see the dog cut in half or whatnot. Obviously, I don't want it to come after me, but I
Right.
want to see it because I can go tell my friends. I'm like, yeah, there's like jars of brains and there's a heart, on the desk. I mean, how cool is that? Even in today's
Right.
society, we would still, I mean, we got the Mutter Museum in Philly. I mean, the world of oddities isn't so odd anymore because we've normalized this kind of stuff and we're actually kind of curious about it. We don't kind of keep it on the fringe anymore like we did back in the day.
Right. And I guess kind of to continue this theme of the beginning of the movie with the, I guess it's a combination of part two. We can talk about the Night of the Living Dead reference here and then kind of segue into talking about Bert. But it uses the shop to kind of the opening scenes to kind of connect to the Romero universe, right? By asserting, hey, Night of the Living Dead is based on true stories.
Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah. That's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right? Sure. What about it?
Here's
You know
what
that
really
movie was
happened.
based on a true case.
And it works, I feel like,
Come
in
on,
the
you're
story.
shitting me, right?
I ain't never
It's
been more
it's not
serious in my
trying
life.
to be meta. It's not trying to reference something that I mean, people already knew in the 80s Night of the Living Dead,
Right.
so it was an easy reference. And obviously with John Russo being involved, it was an easy way to, have that connective tissue
Right.
and kind of not put it down or, make it comedic in any way, but it's like, hey, this is what happened and they made a movie about it, and you can think about the movie however you want in their world. But, he's trying to say, well, that was a dramatization of what happened back in 68. And, here's the real story. And I think that's the precipice that, kicks off the rest of the movie is him trying to impress Freddie and whatnot. But I think I think people were wondering about that connective tissue that, there really weren't a lot of the Living Dead or of the Dead movies. I mean, we had City of the Living Dead. I think most of them at the time, you know, Italy, Europe,
Yeah.
had those types of movies. I'm sure someone who's listening will think, well, there was 35 movies of the Dead between 1970 whatever, and
Right.
but I mean, how many are you going to reference without really being in it? So people knew Night of the Living Dead. By the time Dawn came out, it was popular. Dawn comes out, which obviously reignites the love for Night. At that point, home video was happening. So, Dawn and Night had been on beta and VHS. Day had come out in '84. So there were a lot of people that were very familiar with it. So I think there was a lot of excitement for more zombies. And, I think the strength of Return of the Living Dead is that it is completely different. It's not trying to emulate or ridicule or, you know, put down any of the other zombie movies. They just went in a completely different direction that no one had done before, and I think that worked for them.
Absolutely. And kind of to go back to something we were talking about earlier about characters and characterizations, Clu Gulager is Bert. It's funny because, right, so much of the movie is based on him just trying not to get in trouble for having illegal military stuff. And in a movie now, you'd play it up like, oh, this is the terrible boss, but he's still pretty likable and still kind of trying to do the right thing while also being like, no, these are just rabid animals in a plastic bag. Um, I guess I don't know. I feel like so much of the movie hinges on him still being sympathetic. Those guys still being sympathetic while also like being kind of dunderheaded, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Bert is a likable boss. He's him and Frank obviously have worked together for a while, and Frank's more of Frank's the reason everything happens more or less. Even when Bert comes back, in most movies the boss is usually a secondary villain. They're the ones trying to cover it up. I mean, obviously Bert is, but he's not doing it in a way where he's not likable or you wouldn't say, well, you know what, my boss would probably do the same thing. Or I
Right.
know someone's boss who would do the same thing. He's trying to protect his folks, protect his business, but not at the expense of anybody or anything else.
But he's still trying
And
to
I
help
think that-
everybody the whole time. Yeah.
yeah, he's not he's not undermining, anybody. He's not trying to sabotage anything. He's working with everybody else. And I think that's why Bert, he isn't like your evil bosses that you see in movies most of the time, especially in that era.
Right. Right. And his relationship with Ernie is hilarious throughout the movie. Showing like so much. I feel so much of the movie also hinges on the dynamic between, you have the older characters, the Frank, Bert, and Ernie, and then their relationship with the younger characters, and it never feels weird or out of place or anachronistic in any kind of way.
I would love a prequel with those two.
Yes,
because they've
absolutely.
seen some shit and they've been through some shit. I mean, obviously, their businesses are next door to each other and they complement each other. Because if Bert needs something, he can just go over and be like, "Hey, Ernie, can I use your crematory again? Because I got stuff that went bad. Okay, I'll just burn it up." That you could tell they're buddies and that you don't really get any of the backstory, but their chemistry really just worked. And my liking of the film starts really a lot in the second half once they get over there.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
And having them all starting to interact a little bit more, because the comedy one is not forced.
Right.
I think the comedy isn't trying to, turn around and wink at the audience, or it's not trying to stop the action or the horror for the sake of comedy. And it comes out through the dialogue. And I think that came with the fact that you've got some seasoned actors, kind of leading the movie. And, there's no one they really don't do anything stupid.
Right.
They don't, like open up the door when they shouldn't or anything. So they all play it smart. They all show that they do got some wisdom. There's not a lot of infighting, like you see in these movies where they just, break down and, one group goes rogue. They do kind of work together. You didn't see that a lot at the time. And in a lot of movies, you still don't see that as much as I like, which I think makes it very believable. And I think it doesn't distract the audience from just enjoying the film as a whole. It doesn't really slow the pace down when they want to stand there and talk, because they're always kind of feeling, you can believe that they're kind of trying to figure this out in real time and not trying to think they're some expert.
Right, and they're all generally working on the same side, even if they're disagreeing, which is like whether it's trying to get the ambulance outside and all these circumstances, they're never, like you're saying, they never, I'll go my way, you go your way, or any of those tropes that you see, especially in 80s horror movies, where you're like, well, this group of idiots is going to go get it, because
yeah,
they're still following there is some sort of logic to what they're doing.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out what works, and it didn't work. Okay, they'll go back to the drawing board, and they're not trying to fight over each other. They're not trying, the older guys aren't trying to screw the kids over. They're trying to save the kids. They realize they need to work together, and and obviously in the movie, next to the zombies, the military is the main villain, because they are the cause of all of this, and they're going to be the reason the movie ends the way it does. But they're very real characters. They're talking it out. Someone's like, well, that's not going to work, and well, why not? And they go back and forth, and it doesn't. There's no one, I think, character that tries to overshadow the others and downplay others' contributions. They're all frantic. So I think it was played for, you gotta think, but you're still hyped up, and you're not perfect. You're gonna make mistakes. You're not gonna know how to handle the situation. So do the best you can. And I think that's a very real response to, if all of a sudden the dead come back to life and are knocking at your door.
Right. And it's something, obviously, Return of the Living Dead plays it a little differently, but the Romero movies are very similar in those terms too, in terms of, I feel like there's a logic to the way that people act that is, when a movie is not good, you're like, why is this person making this decision? Nobody, even in a circumstance like this, would do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you see that a lot in Night and Day. Night, you've got the conflict between Harry Cooper and
Right.
Ben, and in Day you've got the military versus the scientist. Dawn is really the outlier, which of course Dawn is my favorite film, and it's the one where the group actually works together, and you see them working together even though they really don't know each other. They have a common goal of surviving, and they don't really have any sort of arguments or disagreements that negatively affect what they're trying to do until the bikers come in.
Right.
And obviously Flyboy makes the mistake of firing off his gun, and that starts the whole downfall of them. But it is refreshing when you get a movie that tends to feel smarter by not just having conflict to have conflict because you need it.
Right.
George has always said, and it's very evident, his movies are about people and relationships, and the zombies, are secondary. If you can't get along with your fellow human, you're going to lose to this group over here because you guys need to learn how to work together. And I feel, maybe the folks in Return of the Living Dead could have survived at some point, had
Right.
the ending not happen. They may have gotten out of it, maybe not all of them, but there was a feeling that they could have, and
Right.
I think that's what keeps you kind of invested, is like, I really want them to make it. They weren't you weren't rooting for really anybody to die, which you see a lot in movies anyway. So I think that's what helps when you go back and rewatch Return of the Living Dead. It doesn't you can sit and watch it and turn your mind off. You
Right.
don't have to think a lot about it because and I don't mean that in a bad way. I think, a movie is really great when it makes you think, but then I think a movie is really great when you don't have to think because you're getting everything you need visually from the story.
Right.
And Return does do that.
And to that point, there is always, whether it's The Walking Dead or a lot of, horror movies in general, there's always at least like the one person in the group where you're like, this guy really needs, or a girl really needs to get it. And there is nobody, everybody's at least generally genial, even if some of the punk, like, Trash is a little nutty, like whatever, like they're all generally likable. You're never like, this person needs to, have the tar man come after them. But, let's pivot, I guess, as much as these movies are about people sticking together, they are also about, zombies. How are the zombies in Return of the Living Dead presented differently, I guess, than, Romero presented them in his original films? And kind of how did it establish the way zombies pop up, proliferate in culture afterwards?
Well, I mean, the big difference is George used the recently deceased, where if you die, you're coming back very quickly. Where if you're dead and in a casket, you're not coming back. You're not getting, they're not coming out of the cemetery. Where of course, Night of the Living Dead uses there's that mechanism of the trioxin. It's reanimating
Right.
every single corpse that it comes in contact with, and that's obviously very believable. And George's movies have very little humor in them, especially, I mean, unlike Dawn of the Dead, where you got a pie fight, you do have zombies for laughs, but that was very intentional for George to kind of tell the story, the underlying story of consumerism and all that. Where Return of the Living Dead, I don't want to say slapstick, but you've got the zombies. They're able to think, they're able to speak, they're able to run and strategize. They lay the ambush out for the paramedics and the cops.
Dispatch, do you copy over?
Come in dispatch. Send more paramedics.
They call for more paramedics. The half zombie on the slab, she's kind of giving exposition that, they eat brains because the pain of being dead is too much.
Why do you eat people?
Not people. Brains.
Brains only.
Yes.
Why?
The pain.
What about the pain?
The pain of being dead.
But it works. I mean, it's plausible. You wake up dead and you hurt and you realize you're craving brains and you eat brains and you don't hurt anymore. running, talking, strategizing zombies, I think works in films like Return of the Living Dead when you set that up. But if you tried to have that in something like The Walking Dead or any other type of zombie film anymore, it wouldn't quite work unless you really establish it early on and make it plausible.
They ask, how do you kill something that's already dead? The zombies don't die like they do in the Romero movies. It's a completely different, right? It's not, hit them in the head with a hammer or shoot them in the head and they're gone. They're essentially invincible, minus, fire, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to dig down one layer, I'd say it's probably whatever the trioxin is.
Right.
It was probably engineered that way.
Right.
And I think you got the Romero movies, you got Fulci Zombie, Living Dead at Manchester Morgue. There were already a couple of films out there that kind of subscribed. Obviously, starting with George, shoot him in the head, and they'll go down. But it is kind of refreshing that they are kind of invincible, and they are kind of super strong, and probably because of the trioxin. The military wanted a super soldier. That's probably where the trioxin came from, or whatever it was, or it was a byproduct of something. And now you have these basically, like you said, invincible corpses running around that will devour you, and you can't just shoot them. You really got to cut them up and burn them, and that's something different. And I do like when you do a zombie film and they don't have the same weaknesses, but they have, plausible strengths, or, there is something that can hurt them.
I think that's probably to its credit, right? Because it's hard to do something different, I would feel. Let me backtrack, because George obviously did a lot of different things with his movies, but those in terms of the people, right, and the situation. The zombie as character, it seems like it is a difficult horror character to try to do something different with, right? Like, World War Z's big thing was the zombies can run, like, right? Like, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it's weird for me to say. I do like World War Z.
I do too. I think it's fine.
It's funny. It wasn't on TV, but something popped up, and I even said to my wife the other night, I was like, I like it, and I've always liked it, and I think I liked it because it does something different. It takes you around the world at the start of the zombie apocalypse. So you start where you think it began, and then you go to the Middle East, and then you end up here. So you get a bunch of different characters at different points of the film. And I don't really have any I think the biggest problem I have with World War Z is Brad Pitt, and I like Brad Pitt.
Right.
I just don't think he was the right person for that. I think, to me, having someone less Brad Pitt,
Absolutely,
like a status of Brad Pitt, I think probably would have helped the film. Because I think it detracted, because as much as I love Brad Pitt, you're kind of getting the same performance in every Brad Pitt film.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, doing something different in the zombie genre is very hard, because you've got basically the same type of zombie. I think the best zombie films are slow zombies. I am a slow zombie purist. The Dawn of the Dead remake is one of my least favorite films ever made. Even though, I did go see it in the theater a bunch, but that was to support George, secondhand. And then, I had friends that were in the movie, so I wanted to go and support them and whatnot. But then when you get to stuff like, 28 Days Later, where they're infected, they're not zombies, but zombie-esque to a point. I don't know if you've ever seen The Dead.
I think I have.
Have you ever seen that?
I believe so.
It came out like 2012. It takes mostly in the desert in
Yes.
Africa.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. It's very, like, the zombies remind me very much of Fulci zombies. With the military mix and whatnot. There's just something about the pacing of that one that I really enjoy. And I think to make a zombie film different is you have to play with the pacing, the backdrop, and the human characters more than anything. Because if you try to work too much with the zombies, you're really gonna disrupt, I think, the status quo or the core of what that movie is. Look what they did with vampires.
Right.
They made vampires sparkle. They made vampires romantic, which they were already kind of romanticized. But when you turn them into teenagers that sparkle, and you, I love when things swing for the fences,
Right.
to be different. I'm a fan of Halloween Ends because they tried something different.
That's a hot take.
We
I'll
have the
talk to you
same
about
Michael-
after
we-
this is all up.
Yeah. I mean, we have 12 of the same Michael Myers movies.
Right.
Let's try something different.
Right.
It's why I love Jason X. I'm like, let's put him in space.
I
This
do
is
love
awesome.
Jason X. Yeah, Jason. Right, it's Jason in space. What more do you need? Like, that's,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
the log
it's-
line. Sure.
Yeah. And I think, Return of the Living Dead being a, punk rock 80s film was maybe what the zombie genre needed at the time, because between, pretty much, I mean, Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, absolutely love it. I think that was 75. Once you get Dawn in 77, 78, and then you go straight through to 84, almost all those zombie films are the same, especially the ones from Europe and Italy. They were brought back by some voodoo or something,
Right.
but they were, they took the flesh-eating part of the Romero and they took the voodoo part from the Haitian stuff that George kind of moved them out of, and they kind of tried to merge them. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Like I said, Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, absolutely phenomenal film. It's one that I watch constantly. It's kind of a comfort film. I can just sit there, put it on, and do whatever. But then when you add the 80s into the mix, I think that, injecting what the 80s culture had been at that point into zombie films, I think they put the right amount in, and they changed enough that I don't think people look at Return of the Living Dead and try to compare it to anything else, because at the end of the day, you can't.
Right.
You can't compare George's films to other films, but you can only compare other films to George's,
Right.
because George was the trailblazer. Those 3 original zombie films laid the groundwork for films like Return of the Living Dead to shoot off and do things different with. And no one was doing it like George. I don't think anyone ever will do it like George. A lot of people have come close. I grew up in the 80s. I watched Return of the Living Dead. I will go on record that I love Return of the Living Dead Part 2, heads and tails above Return of the Living Dead. It's
Interesting.
my
I was going to
Return of
ask
the
you
Living
about
Dead.
the sequel, so we'll have to go to that. We'll touch on that next, because I am not familiar with any of them.
Yep, I'll expand on that one then. But Return of the Living Dead, I always, whenever it was on TV, or my dad never taped it, but every once in a while it would either rent it or it'd be on TV, and I'm like, yeah, this is cool. Like, I grew up loving it. I still love it to this day. I don't, it like we were talking earlier, it's not one of those films that you can't watch today because it's kind of not socially acceptable to listen to those jokes. I mean, even when you look back at the teenage comedies of Porky's and Meatballs, and even my Porky's was American Pie.
Right.
So when you go back, American Pie's problematic now.
Yeah, I
It's
saw
like,
Trail
man,
pretty good recently. I was like, wow, I
was
saw
like-
this in theaters.
yeah, even like Road Trip. I watched Road Trip for the first time a couple of months ago. I pulled it off the shelf. I was like, man, I haven't watched this in a while. And I watched it and I was like, oh yeah, we're kind of getting far enough away that when we look back on this, like, oh, this isn't, it's a little cringy, you know, but again, what movies are funny now that in 20 years we're going to look back and go, oh wow, that's really outdated.
Right.
And, and I think if you work hard enough to make a movie timeless, you're smart enough to not try to put in pop culture references or things that are going to date the film to a specific point in time, and avoiding all of that. I think helps the longevity, and I think it helps a lot of people be able to come into that film at any point in 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Now, like, yes, son, this is the movie that I watched as a kid. Now I want you to watch it. And you've got no qualm showing them about it, because it's not something that they're going to have to like, am I going to get a call from the principal about this one?
Right.
Because, there's always like one line in one movie that you're just like, oh, I can't wait to get past this scene. And you're watching the kid more than you're watching the movie.
No, like if I showed my kids Monster Squad today, my wife would just come flying out of the room and give me a roundhouse kick.
Nostalgia is a hell of a drug. And we watch movies with the glasses on, trying to recapture that euphoric moment of the first time we saw a film like this when we were kids.
Right.
And when it doesn't hit us the way that it did when we were kids, because it's a completely different film 35 years later, we're like, oh, that's not good.
Right.
Well, is it? Is it true? Or are you just not wanting to like it because it wasn't what you wanted it to be, and you used to not care about that when you went and watched a film?
Right. And I guess we'll see that play out with this movie, right? Isn't there's a legacy sequel or remake or reboot coming for Return of the Living Dead, right? I think later this year. I feel like I saw it somewhere.
Quite possibly. I mean, there's always talk in this day and age of remaking something, especially now we're far enough away from the 80s where I think they're trying to dip their toes in some of the stuff that they probably wouldn't have wanted touched.
Right. Bring back the Tar Man, make the Tar Man a thing, which I guess maybe this is a good jumping off point, is that like when you watch the first movie, there's not the thought in my head, at least, that the Tar Man is about to become a figure like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees that's just recurring in movie after movie after movie.
Yeah, I mean, with zombies, it's very hard to have that type of spearhead figure that you can kind of put in every movie.
Right.
Because most zombie films are very localized. They're going to be, everyone's going to have their own spin on the zombies. But yeah, you're right. I mean, next to, some of George's iconic zombies and Fulci zombies, you have Tar Man, who was never in. I don't think the intent was to ever make him a marketable.
No, just like a weird thing in the movie. That's how I took it, at least.
Yeah. I mean, he's only in the movie for a very short amount of time, and but his image is used to promote the movie a lot in today's day and age,
right.
And I think that's probably due to the fact that a lot of people, who grew up watching this movie, it's easily relatable. There's that one image that you can put on a thing and people know it's Return of the Living Dead, because the poster has that awesome, female and male punk skeleton with the spray painting of the graffiti. But, they weren't in the movie really. Tar Man was. Right. And he's the first one to say brain. So I think that just by happenstance, he became the de facto face of the franchise. And really, I mean, he's only in 2 movies, and between both movies, he probably has less than 5 minutes of screen time.
Interesting. Let's talk about the other movies. There was 3, right? 3 other sequels?
I think they went to a total of 5,
okay.
Maybe 6.
They any good?
I mean, I love
Return
of the Living.
Yeah.
I love 2. I part 2 to me is they did the same thing that Evil Dead did, basically.
Right.
They took the first film and they kind of remade it. You've got a new central character of Jesse, but almost same thing. But then you bring back Frank and Freddy, but you change up their characters. You make them 2 completely different characters, but they're still working together. Mm-hmm. It's not punk. It's a more family-friendly film, I guess. Really no nudity, obviously still gore. It leans heavy into the comedy. Like I said, it's the Evil Dead 2 of the Return of the Living Dead franchise. For some reason, that's just always been the one I gravitated to. My dad had taped it off TV, so I always had it accessible, and that could be why. I love Return of the Living Dead 2, but I have no issues with Return of the Living Dead Part 1. They're both, right. 1 and 1A. They're almost in essence the same movie. Like I said, a lot of the same plot points hit. I just think, I don't know. Return of the Living Dead 2 is just way too much fun for me to ever not say that it's not my favorite. Part 3, interesting. I haven't watched Part 3 in a long time. I own the Vestron Blu-ray with Melinda Clark. And I want to say I probably bought it, and the day I got it, I probably watched it. I don't know if I've gone back to it. And it's kind of funny. I don't know why. Because that was made, 94?
and
3.
stumbled on the chilling fact
And it's completely unrelated to
that
the
even
first
the
two.
dead can go on
You know, a
living.
guy's girlfriend gets killed, I think, in a motorcycle accident, and he brings her
And
back.
tonight, fate will put their
Other
promises
than that, I know a lot of people really do
the
like
test.
that one. But other than that, maybe I'll go watch that tonight, because it's, like I said, it's been a minute. Now I'm actually kind of thinking about it. There's something about the first Return of the Living Dead that has really stuck
Interesting.
with people. And I remember getting so pissed because right before COVID, they were going to have the kid who played Jesse from part 2 at Days of the Dead in Indianapolis, and I was going to drive the 10 hours to go meet him, because I'm
wow.
like,
Yeah.
Return of the Living Dead part 2 is finally getting some love on the convention circuit. And then COVID happened.
Naturally.
And he hasn't done a show since.
Of course.
But, it's just one of those things where, there's enough of this to go around. And I think, part 1 has rightfully earned its place in zombie fandom and in the horror genre.
Yep. I have one last question for you here.
Sure.
So, Return of the Living Dead takes place on July 3rd, which coincidentally is where we will be screening Return of the Living Dead here in Scenic, Schenectady, New York at Proctor's Theater on that date. Would you rather, if you were stuck in a situation where the dead come back to life, what season of the year? July, like summer, winter? What time of year do you think would be the ideal climb to endure?
Springtime.
Springtime. Why?
Because the days are getting longer, and I have more chance to prepare for a long winter by being outside and gathering supplies, knowing I'm going to have to hunker down and live old school. Fall's my favorite season, but I mean, March, April would probably be the perfect time, because I know I've got 7 months, 8 months to gather supplies or move somewhere warm if I have the ability. The days are longer. I can see out, I can be out longer and see what's going on, rather than it's starting in the fall or winter and it's constantly dark and I'm having to worry about, I can't grow food. It's cold. I got to, stay warm and whatnot. Someone's going to say, well, in the wintertime, zombies can slow down. Oh, we haven't really seen that happen in films yet. So I'm not going to buy into the,
Right.
They're going to freeze in the wintertime. So I'm going to go spring, just to give myself a bit of time. I mean, I'm an Eagle Scout, so I can lash stuff and, build fires and, sort of survive out in the wilderness with what I can remember. So yeah, I'll go springtime. I know this isn't going to, be a weekend problem, and we're probably going to head into, the winter months. I want to be able to have time to find some place secure, stockpile supplies, chop wood for a fireplace or a stove that I'm going to have to keep me warm, and think about the long haul.
There we go. And we will leave it at that. Matt, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you guys. This is funny. I don't ever talk about Return of the Living Dead. I always do Romero, Blair Witch, and other stuff. So this is kind of refreshing. It was funny when we were first talking about this. I was like, man, I'm gonna have to pop this in a few times. And I remember sitting there watching it, and I'm like, man, I remember a lot more about this film than I thought I did. It was kind of like watching it intently for the first time in a long time, where I wasn't just doing something else in the room and it was playing. But I did. I enjoyed it. It's one of those films I enjoy more now than what I did even 10, 15 years ago. So it's very fun and refreshing, because I don't think there's a lot of... I mean, there probably is a lot of discussion about Return of the Living Dead, but I think sometimes it just ends up being kind of the same thing over and over again. So going a little bit in depth and talking about this kind of differently has actually been really, really fun.
I'm glad.